Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in Erewhon by Samuel Butler. We are on Chapter 4, and this is entitled The Saddle. And with that, I'll begin. I cooeyed to him, but he would not hear. I ran after him, but he had got too good a start. Then I sat down on a stone and thought the matter carefully over. It was plain that Chowbuck had decidedly attempted to keep me away from going up this valley. Yet he had shown no unwillingness to follow me anywhere else. What could this mean, unless that I was now upon the route by which alone the mysteries of the great ranges could be revealed? What then should I do? Go back at the very moment when it had become plain that I was on the right scent? Hardly. Yet to proceed alone would be both difficult and dangerous. It would be bad enough to return to my master's run and pass through the rocky gorges with no chance of help from another, should I get into a difficulty. But to advance from any considerable distance without a companion would be next door to madness. Accidents, which are slight when there is another at hand, as the spraining of an ankle or the falling into some place whence escape would be easy by means of an outstretched hand and a bit of rope, may be fatal to one who was alone. The more I pondered, the less I liked it, and yet the less could I make up my mind to return when I looked at the saddle at the head of the valley and noted the comparative ease with which its smooth sweep of snow might be surmounted. I seemed to see my way almost from my present position to the very top. After much thought, I resolved to go forward until I should come to some place which was really dangerous, but then to return. I should thus, I hoped, at any rate reach the top of the saddle, and satisfy myself as to what might be on the other side. I had no time to lose, for it was now between 10 and 11 in the morning. Fortunately, I was well equipped, for on leaving the camp and horses at the lower end of the valley, I had provided myself, according to my custom, with everything that I was likely to want for 4 or 5 days. Chowbuck had carried half, but had dropped his whole swag, I suppose, at the moment of his taking flight, for I came upon it when I ran after him. I had therefore his provisions as well as my own. Accordingly, I took as many biscuits as I thought I could carry, and also some tobacco, tea, and a few matches. I rolled all these things, together with a flask nearly full of brandy, which I had kept in my pocket for fear lest Chowbuck should get hold of it, inside my blankets, and strapped them very tightly, making the whole into a long roll of some 7 feet in length and 6 inches in diameter. Then I tied the 2 ends together and put the whole round my neck and over one shoulder. This is the easiest way of carrying a heavy swag, for one can rest oneself by shifting the burden from one shoulder to the other. I strapped my pannikin and a small axe about my waist, and thus equipped began to ascend the valley, angry at having been misled by Chowbuck, but determined not to return till I was compelled to do so. I crossed and recrossed the stream several times without difficulty, for there were many good fords. At 1 o'clock I was at the foot of the saddle. For 4 hours I mounted, and the last 2 on the snow, where the going was easier. By 5 I was within 10 minutes of the top, in a state of excitement, greater, I think, than I had ever known before. 10 minutes more, and the cold air from the other side came rushing upon me. A glance. I was not on the mountain range. Another glance. There was an awful river, muddy and horribly angry, roaring over an immense riverbed thousands of feet below me. It went round to the westward, and I could see no farther up the valley, save that there were enormous glaciers which must extend round the source of the river, and from which it must spring. Another glance, and then I remained motionless. There was an easy pass in the mountains directly opposite to me, through which I caught a glimpse of an immeasurable extent of blue and distant plains. Easy? Yes, perfectly easy. Grassed nearly to the summit, which was as it were an open path between 2 glaciers, from which an inconsiderable stream came tumbling down over rough but very possible hillsides, till it got down to the level of the great river and formed a flat where there was grass and a small bush of stunted timber. Almost before I could believe my eyes, a cloud had come upon the valley on the other side, and the plains were hidden. What wonderful luck was mine! Had I arrived 5 minutes later, the cloud would have been over the pass, and I should have not known of its existence. Now that the cloud was there, I began to doubt my memory, and to be uncertain whether it had been more than a blue line of distant vapor that had filled up the opening. I could only be certain of this much, namely that the river in the valley below must be the one next to the northward of that which flowed past my master's station. Of this there could be no doubt. Could I, however, imagine that my luck should have led me up a wrong river in search of a pass, and yet brought me to the spot where I could detect the one weak place in the fortifications of a more northern basin? This was too improbable. But even as I doubted, there came a rent in the cloud opposite, and a second time I saw blue lines of heaving downs, growing gradually fainter and retiring into a far space of plain. It was substantial. There had been no mistake whatsoever. I had hardly made myself perfectly sure of this, ere the rent in the clouds joined up again, and I could see nothing more. What then should I do? The night would be upon me shortly, and I was already chilled with standing still after the exertion of climbing. To stay where I was would be impossible. I must either go backwards or forwards. I found a rock which gave me shelter from the evening wind, and took a good pull at the brandy flask, which immediately warmed and encouraged me. I asked myself, could I descend upon the riverbed beneath me? It was impossible to say what precipices might prevent my doing so. If I were on the riverbed, dare I cross the river? I am an excellent swimmer, yet once in that frightful rush of waters, I should be hurled whithersoever it willed, absolutely powerless. Moreover, there was my swag. I should perish of cold and hunger if I left it, but I should certainly be drowned if I attempted to carry it across the river. These were serious considerations, but the hope of finding an immense tract of available sheep country, which I was determined that I would monopolize as far as I possibly could, sufficed to outweigh them, and in a few minutes I felt resolved that, having made so important a discovery as a pass into a country which was probably as valuable as that on our side of the ranges, I would follow it up and ascertain its value, even though I should pay the penalty of failure with life itself. The more I thought, the more determined I became either to win fame and perhaps fortune by entering upon this unknown world, or give up life in the attempt. In fact, I felt that life would be no longer valuable if I were to have seen so great a prize and refused to grasp at the possible profits therefrom. I had still an hour of good daylight, during which I might begin my descent onto some suitable camping ground, but there was not a moment to be lost. At first I got along rapidly, for I was on the snow and sank into it enough to save me from falling, though I went forward straight down the mountain side as fast as I could. But there was less snow on this side than the other, and I had soon done with it, getting onto a comb of dangerous and very stony ground, where a slip might have given me a disastrous fall. But I was careful with all my speed and got safely to the bottom, where there were patches of coarse grass and an attempt here and there at brushwood. What was below this I could not see. I advanced a few hundred yards farther, and found that I was on the brink of a frightful precipice, which no one in his senses would attempt descending. I bethought me, however, to try the cheek which drained the comb, and see whether it might have made itself a smoother way. In a few minutes I found myself at the upper end of a chasm in the rocks, something like 'twill do, only on a greatly larger scale. The creek had found its way into it, and had worn a deep channel through a material which appeared softer than that upon the other side of the mountain. I believe it must have been a different geological formation, though I regret to say that I cannot tell what it was. I looked at this rift in great doubt. Then I went a little way on either side of it, and found myself looking over the edge of horrible precipices onto the river, which roared some 4,000 or 5,000 feet below me. I dared not think of getting down at all, unless I committed myself to the rift, of which I was hopeful when I reflected that the rock was soft, and that the water might have worn its channel tolerably even through the whole extent. The darkness was increasing with every minute, but I should have twilight for another half-hour, so I went into the chasm, though by no means without fear, and resolved to return and camp and try some other path next day, should I come to any serious difficulty. In about 5 minutes I had completely lost my head. The side of the rift became hundreds of feet in height, and overhung so that I could not see the sky. It was full of rocks, and I had many falls and bruises. I was wet through from falling into the water, of which there was no great volume, but it had such a force that I could do nothing against it. Once I had to leap down a not inconsiderable waterfall into a deep pool below, and my swag was so heavy that I was very nearly drowned. I had indeed a hair's breadth escape, but as luck would have it, Providence was on my side. Shortly afterwards I began to fancy that the rift was getting wider, and that there was more brushwood. Presently I found myself on an open grassy slope, and feeling my way a little farther along the stream, I came upon a flat place with wood, where I could camp comfortably, which was well, for it was now quite dark. My first care was for my matches. Were they dry? The outside of my swag had got completely wet, but on the undoing blankets I found things warm and dry within. How thankful I was. I lit a fire and was grateful for its warmth and company. I made myself some tea and ate 2 of my biscuits. My brandy I did not touch, for I had little left, and might want it when my courage failed me. All that I did almost mechanically, for I could not realize my situation to myself, beyond knowing that I was alone, and that return through the chasm which I had just descended would be impossible. It is a dreadful feeling, that of being cut off from all one's kind. I was still full of hope, and built golden castles for myself as soon as I was warmed with food and fire, but I do not believe that any man could long retain his reason in such solitude, unless he have the companionship of animals. One begins doubting one's own identity. I remember deriving comfort even from the sight of my blankets and the sound of my watch ticking, things which seemed to link me to other people, but the screaming of the wood hens frightened me, as also a chattering bird which I had never heard before, and which seemed to laugh at me, though I soon got used to it, and before long could fancy that it was many years since I had first heard it. I took off my clothes and wrapped my inside blanket about me till my things were dry. The night was very still, and I made a roaring fire, so I soon got warm, and at last could put my clothes on again. Then I strapped my blanket round me and went to sleep as near the fire as I could. I dreamed that there was an organ placed in my master's woolshed. The woolshed faded away, and the organ seemed to grow and grow amid a blaze of brilliant light, till it became like a golden city upon the side of a mountain, with rows upon rows of pipes set in cliffs and precipices, one above the other, and in mysterious caverns like that of Fingal, within whose depths I could see the burnished pillars gleaming. In the front there was a flight of lofty terraces, at the top of which I could see a man with his head buried forwards towards a keyboard, and his body swaying from side to side amid the storm of huge arpeggioed harmonies that came crashing overhead and round. Then there was one who touched me on the shoulder and said, "Do you not see? It is Handel." But I had hardly apprehended, and was trying to scale the terraces and get near him, when I awoke, dazzled with the vividness and distinctness of the dream. A piece of wood had burned through, and the ends had fallen into ashes with a blaze. This, I supposed, had both given me my dream and robbed me of it. I was bitterly disappointed, and sitting upon my elbow, came back to reality and my strange surroundings as best I could. I was thoroughly aroused. Moreover, I felt a foreshadowing, as though my attention were arrested by something more than the dream, although no sense in particular was as yet appealed to. I held my breath and waited, and then I heard. Was it fancy? Nay. I listened again and again, and I did hear a faint and extremely distant sound of music, like that of an aeolian harp, borne upon the wind which was blowing fresh and chill from the opposite mountains. The roots of my hair thrilled. I listened, but the wind had died, and fancying that it must have been the wind itself, no. On a sudden I remembered the noise which Chapuk had made in the woolshed. Yes, it was that. Thank heaven, whatever it was over now. I reasoned with myself and recovered my firmness. I became convinced that I had only been dreaming more vividly than usual. Soon I began even to laugh, and think what a fool I was to be frightened at nothing, reminding myself that even if I were to come to a bad end, it would be no such a dreadful matter after all. I said my prayers, a duty which I too often neglected, and in a little time fell into a really refreshing sleep, which lasted till broad daylight and restored me. I rose, and searching among the embers of fire, I found a few live coals, and soon had a blaze again. I got breakfast, and was delighted to have the company of several small birds, which hopped about me and perched on my boots and hands. I felt comparatively happy, but I can assure the reader that I had had a far worse time of it than I have told him, and I strongly recommend him to remain in Europe if he can, or at any rate in some country which has been explored and settled, rather than go into places where others have not been before him. Exploring is delightful to look forward to and back upon, but it is not comfortable at the time, unless it be of such an easy nature as not to deserve the name. Chapter 5. The River and the Range. My next business was to descend upon the river. I had lost sight of the pass which I had seen from the saddle, but had made such notes of it that I could not fail to find it. I was bruised and stiff, and my boots had begun to give, for I had been going on rough ground for more than 3 weeks, but as the day wore on, I found myself descending without serious difficulty. I became easier. In a couple of hours I got among pine forests where there was little undergrowth, and descended quickly till I reached the edge of another precipice, which gave me a great deal of trouble, though I eventually managed to avoid it. By about 3 or 4 o'clock I found myself on the riverbed. From calculations which I made as to the height of the valley on the other side, the saddle over which I had come, I concluded that the saddle itself could not be less than 9,000 feet high, and I should think that the riverbed onto which I now descended was 3,000 feet above the sea level. The water had a terrific current, with a fall of not less than 40 to 50 feet per mile. It was certainly the river next to the northward of that which flowed past my master's run, and would have had to go through an impassable gorge, as is commonly the case with the rivers of that country, before it came upon known parts. It was reckoned to be nearly 2,000 feet above the sea level where it came out of the gorge onto the plains. As soon as I got to the riverside, I liked it even less than I thought I should. It was muddy, being near its parent glaciers. The stream was wide, rapid, and rough, and I could hear the smaller stones knocking against each other under the rage of the waters, as upon a seashore. Fording was out of the question. I could not swim and carry my swag, and I dared not leave my swag behind me. My only chance was to make a small raft, and that would be difficult to make, and not at all safe when it was made, not for one man in such a current. As it was too late to do much that afternoon, I spent the rest of it going up and down the riverside and seeing where I should find the most favorable crossing. Then I camped early, and had a quiet, comfortable night with no more music, for which I was thankful, as it had haunted me all day, although I perfectly well knew that it had been nothing but my own fancy, brought on by the reminiscence of what I had heard from Chapuk, and by the overexcitement of the preceding evening. Next day I began gathering the dry bloom stalks of a kind of flag or iris-looking plant, which was abundant, and whose leaves, when torn into strips, were as strong as the strongest string. I brought them to the waterside and fell to making myself a kind of rough platform, which should suffice for myself and my swag if I could only stick to it. The stalks were 10 or 12 feet long, and very strong, but light and hollow. I made my raft entirely of them, binding bundles of them at right angles to each other neatly and strongly, with strips from the leaves of the same plant, and tying other rods across. It took me all day till nearly 4 o'clock to finish the raft, but I had still enough daylight for crossing and resolved on doing so at once. I had selected a place where the river was broad and comparatively still, some 70 or 80 yards above a furious rapid. At this spot I had built my raft. I now launched it, made my swag fast to the middle, and got onto it myself, keeping in my hand one of the longest blossom stalks, so that I might punt myself across as long as the water was shallow enough to let me do so. I got on it pretty well for 20 or 30 yards from the shore, but even in this short space I nearly upset my raft by shifting too rapidly from one side to the other. The water then became much deeper, and I leaned over so far in order to get the bloom rod to the bottom that I had to stay still, leaning on the rod for a few seconds. Then when I lifted up the rod from the ground, the current was too much for me, and I found myself being carried down the rapid. Everything in a second flew past me, and I had no more control over the raft. Neither can I remember anything except hurry and noise, and waters which in the end upset me. But it all came right, and I found myself near the shore, not more than up to my knees in water, and pulling my raft to land, fortunately upon the left bank of the river, which was the one I wanted. When I had landed, I found that I was about a mile or perhaps a little less below the point from which I started. My swag was wet upon the outside, and I was myself dripping, but I had gained my point, and knew that my difficulties were for a time over. I then lit my fire and dried myself. Having done so, I caught some of the young ducks and seagulls, which were abundant on and near the riverbed, so that I had not only a good meal, of which I was in great want, having an insufficient diet from the time that Chowbok left me, but was also well provided for the morrow. I thought of Chowbok, and felt how useful he had been to me, and in how many ways I was the loser by his absence, having now to do all sorts of things for myself which he had hitherto done for me, and could do infinitely better than I could. Moreover, I had set my heart upon making him a real convert to the Christian religion, which he had already embraced outwardly, though I cannot think that it had taken deep root in his impenetrably stupid nature. I used to catechize him by our campfire, and explain to him the mysteries of the Trinity and of original sin, with which I was myself familiar, having been the grandson of an archdeacon by my mother's side, to say nothing of the fact that my father was a clergyman of the English Church. I was therefore sufficiently qualified for the task, and was the more inclined to it, over and above my real desire to save the unhappy creature from an eternity of torture, by recollecting the promises of St. James, that if anyone converted a sinner, which Chowbok surely was, he should hide a multitude of sins. I reflected, therefore, that the conversion of Chowbok might in some degree compensate for irregularities and shortcomings in my own previous life, the remembrance of which had been more than once unpleasant to me during my recent experiences. Indeed, on one occasion I had gone so far as to baptize him, as well as I could, having ascertained that he had certainly not been both christened and baptized, and gathering from his telling me that he had received the name William from the missionary, that it was probably the first mentioned rite to which he had been subjected. I thought it great carelessness on the part of the missionary to have omitted the second, and certainly more important ceremony which I have always understood precedes christening, both in the case of infants and of adult converts. And when I thought of the risk we were both incurring, I determined that there should be no further delay. Fortunately, it was not yet 12 o'clock, so I baptized him at once from one of the pannikins, the only vessels I had, reverently and I trust efficiently. I then set myself to work to instruct him in the deeper mysteries of our belief, and to make him, not only in name, but in heart, a Christian. It is true that I might not have succeeded, for Chowbok was very hard to teach. Indeed, on the evening of the same day that I baptized him, he tried for the 20th time to steal the brandy, which made me rather unhappy as to whether I could have baptized him rightly. He had a prayer book, more than 20 years old, which had been given him by the missionaries, but the only thing in it which had taken any living hold upon him was the title of Adelaide the Queen Dowager, which he would repeat whenever strongly moved or touched, and which did really seem to have some deep spiritual significance to him, though he could never completely separate her individuality from that of Mary Magdalene, whose name had also fascinated him, though in a less degree. He was indeed stony ground, but by digging about him, I might have at any rate deprived him of all faith in the religion of his tribe, which would have been halfway towards making him a sincere Christian. And now all this was cut off from me, and I could neither be a further spiritual assistance to him, nor he of bodily profit to myself. Besides, any company was better than being quite alone. I got very melancholy as these reflections crossed me, but when I had boiled the ducks and eaten them, I was much better. I had a little tea left, and about a pound of tobacco, which should last me for another fortnight with moderate smoking. I had also 8 ship biscuits, and most precious of all, about 6 ounces of brandy, which I presently reduced to 4, for the night was cold. I rose with early dawn, and in an hour I was on my way, feeling strange, not to say weak, from the burden of solitude, but full of hope when I considered how many dangers I had overcome, and that this day should see me at the summit of the dividing range. After a slow but steady climb of between 3 and 4 hours, during which I had met with no serious hindrance, I found myself upon a tableland and close to a glacier which I recognized as marking the summit of the pass. Above it towered a succession of rugged precipices and snowy mountainsides. The solitude was greater than I could bear. The mountain upon my master's sheep run was a crowded thoroughfare in comparison with this somber, sullen place. The air, moreover, was dark and heavy, which made the loneliness even more oppressive. There was an inky gloom over all that was not covered with snow and ice. Grass there was none. Each moment I felt increasing upon me that dreadful doubt as to my own identity, as to the continuity of my past and present existence, which is the first sign of that distraction which comes on those who have lost themselves in the bush. I had fought against this feeling hitherto, and had conquered it, but the intense silence and gloom of this rocky wilderness were too much for me, and I felt that my power of collecting myself was beginning to be impaired. I rested for a little while, and then advanced over very rough ground until I reached the lower end of the glacier. Then I saw another glacier, descending from the eastern side into a small lake. I passed along the western side of the lake, where the ground was easier, and when I had got about halfway, I expected that I should see the plains which I had already seen from the opposite mountains. But it was not to be so, for the clouds rolled up to the very summit of the pass, though they did not overlap it onto the side from which I had come. I therefore soon found myself enshrouded by a cold, thin vapor which prevented me seeing more than a very few yards in front of me. Then I came upon a large patch of old snow, in which I could distinctly trace the half-melted tracks of goats, and in one place, as it seemed to me, there had been a dog following them. Had I lighted upon a land of shepherds? The ground, where not covered with snow, was so poor and stony, and there was so little herbage that I could see no sign of path or regular sheep track, but I could not help feeling rather uneasy as I wondered what sort of reception I might meet with if I were to come suddenly upon inhabitants. I was thinking of this and proceeding cautiously through the mist when I began to fancy that I saw some objects darker than the cloud looming in front of me. A few steps brought me nearer, and a shudder of unutterable horror ran through me when I saw a circle of gigantic forms, many times higher than myself, upstanding grim and gray through the veil of cloud before me. I suppose I must have fainted, for I found myself some time afterwards sitting upon the ground, sick and deadly cold. There were figures, quite still and silent, seen vaguely through the thick gloom, but in human shape indisputably. A sudden thought occurred to me, which would have doubtless struck me at once had I not been possessed with forebodings at the time that I first saw the figures, and had not the cloud concealed them from me. I mean that they were not living beings, but statues. I determined that I would count 50 slowly, and was sure that the objects were not alive if during that time I detected no sign of motion. How thankful was I when I came to the end of my 50 and there had been no movement. I counted a second time, but again all was still. I then advanced timidly forward, and in another moment I saw that my surmise was correct. I had come upon a sort of Stonehenge of rude and barbaric figures, seated as Chowbuk had sat when I questioned him in the wool shed, and with the same superhumanly malevolent expression upon their faces. They had all been seated, but two had fallen. They were barbarous, neither Egyptian nor Assyrian nor Japanese, different from any of these, and yet akin to all. They were 6 or 7 times larger than life, of great antiquity, worn and lichen-grown. They were 10 in number. There was snow upon their heads, and wherever snow could lodge. Each statue had been built of 4 or 5 enormous blocks, but how these had been raised and put together is known to those alone who raised them. Each was terrible after a different kind. One was raging furiously, as in pain, and a great despair. Another was lean and cadaverous with famine. Another cruel and idiotic, but with the silliest simper that can be conceived. This one had fallen, and looked exquisitely ludicrous in his fall. The mouths of all were more than less open, and as I looked at them from behind, I saw that their heads had been hollowed. I was sick and shivering with cold. Solitude had unmanned me already, and I was utterly unfit to have come upon such an assembly of fiends in such a dreadful wilderness, and without preparation. I would have given everything I had in the world to have been back at my master's station, but that was not to be thought of. My head was failing, and I felt sure I could never get back alive. Then came a gust of howling wind, accompanied with a moan from one of the statues above me. I clasped my hands in fear. I felt like a rat caught in a trap, as though I would have turned and bitten at whatever thing was nearest me. The wildness of the wind increased. The moans grew shriller, coming from several statues and swelling into a chorus. I almost immediately knew what it was, but the sound was so unearthly that this was but little consolation. The inhuman beings into whose hearts the evil one had put it to conceive these statues had made their heads into a sort of organ pipe, so that their mouths should catch the wind and sound with its blowing. It was horrible. However brave a man might be, he could never stand such a concert from such lips, and in such a place. I heaped every invective upon them that my tongue could utter as I rushed away from them into the mist, and even after I had lost sight of them, and turning my head round, could see nothing but the storm wraiths driving behind me, I heard their ghostly chanting, and felt as though one of them would rush after me and grip me in his hand and throttle me. I may say here that since my return to England, I heard a friend play some chords upon the organ which put me very forcibly in mind of the Erewhonian statues, for Erewhon is the name of the country upon which I was now entering. They rose most vividly to my recollection the moment my friend began. They are as follows, and are by the greatest of all musicians. This is the end of chapters 4 and 5 of Erewhon by Samuel Butler. Thank you for listening.